Victoria is also interesting in that she's the only character throughout the game who is inherently, and as it turns out, I suppose correctly, on Nathan's side. She frequently refers to his mental problems as a catalyst to his actions, and we generally write that off as nonsense when we're kind of convinced of his guilt. But in fact, it does turn out to be the case, and I think it's probably worth moving into Nathan now, as he's one of the more remorseless and I think, despite the twist at the end, one of the hardest characters to empathise with in this game, I think. His status reminds me of Draco Malfoy or Harry Osborn or Kylo Ren, which sounds obscure from these other media, but it's kind of a consistent stereotype where we have these tragic antagonists that, due to some issues in their past, make them open to manipulation by an older force, such as Voldemort or Snoke or Jefferson. These characters are pushed into crossing a clearly defined moral line that they straddled, and then because they have this vulnerability and this kind of manipulated nature, and obviously some degree of stupidity as well, they opt to irreparably transition into this evil nature. I think the characterization of Nathan as a mentally unstable person was really well done, and every time he appears on screen it's really quite unsettling for me, because he's so prone to these psychotic outbursts. He's obviously mental, and the particular tipping point of this is after breaking into the school during episode 3, Chaos Theory. We find some of his notes on the principal's computer, and we see that he's been obsessively scrawling Rachel in the darkroom over and over again. So, obviously a considerably mental person. But we also note of this as well that Principal Wells is aware of Nathan's mentality, which made me I was always slightly suspicious of Principal Wells, actually, because he's clearly aware of, something's going on here. But at the same time, he's clearly, a coward or a pawn of the Prescotts, because he doesn't seem very confident about investigating this much further. So through this example and other incidental things, such as the psychiatrist's notes that we find and the drug prescriptions in Nathan's room, and, just fleeting comments by secondary characters, an interesting portrait of this character is built up and presented over the course of the game without directly having to interact with him. Indeed, Nathan's bedroom is probably the most telling insight to his character, which hinges both on the morbid and also the tortured aspects of his being. The fact he listens to whale song contrasts strongly with how he's presented in person and conveys this unsettling volatility about him, I think. Indeed, if it wasn't for his status as a Prescott, I'm almost certain that Nathan would have been sectioned rather than allowed to attend high school, because, we can see that on the part of his family, particularly his father, he's being pushed and neglected, and his very real mental problems are being neglected to try and push him into becoming a normal person. So, on this note, I think that Nathan is the ultimate red herring in this game, and up to the end I was actually convinced that it was just a case of catching him, and perhaps some of his family members as well. I felt like, maybe it would be a Prescott that we hadn't yet seen who was responsible for Rachel. Because, personally, I didn't feel that Nathan had the mental fortitude and the intelligence to act alone. But I was always uniquely convinced that it was going to be a Prescott crime. But, alas, Life is Strange threw what I consider to be a very nice curveball. And later Nathan goes from being a supremely dislikable character who would, I would have no qualms about vengeance killing this guy, to someone who, only in the very final stages of the game, becomes, if not sympathetic, at the very least understandable. Indeed, there's a few instances, such as his confession. He calls up Max and is crying down the phone to her like, Jefferson's going to kill me. And also, if you let Warren beat him up in the dorm room, you actually see these kind of glimpses of Nathan's vulnerability and perhaps the scared inner child shine through. But even in light of this, I still don't like him at all, and I really struggled to muster much desire to save him, to be honest, which probably says more about me than it does about him, but there we go. Just finally, actually, I just want to remark on Nathan's photography style, because it's very obvious that he tries to emulate Jefferson, but his own oeuvre, his own body of photographic work, is a very interesting memento mori subject matter that shows his fascination with death and loss. And I don't think it's a vindictive documentation either, as I'm not sure in his heart of hearts that Nathan is an advocate of violence, but it almost shows this kind of fear of death and the unknown that propels his photography forward. And it shows, again, I think, a degree of vulnerability about this character.